Welcome back. So, in my work with survivors of domestic violence, I began increasingly realizing that not all survivors wanted to leave their relationships. What they wanted, though, was for the violence they were experiencing to stop. The reality is that there are times when it might be safer for a survivor of domestic violence and their children to stay in an abusive relationship. I know it's counterintuitive, but we have to recognize the reality that encouraging a survivor to leave could actually increase the danger that they're facing. Quite simply, when a survivor leaves, their abusive partner loses power and control. And this loss of power and control can cause the violence to escalate, and the abusive behavior can become even more dangerous. A victim of domestic violence might be told that they will be killed, or that their children will be killed if they leave or refuse to return. And we know that past violence has taught victims that their partner's threats often translate into action. Leaving an abusive relationship might also mean that their children get harmed, or that their abusive partner gets custody or visitation, which is very likely to happen. So even though we know that violence is wrong and no one should ever have to stay in an abusive relationship, we also have to recognize that the decision to leave is not as straightforward as it might seem. We cannot forget that for some survivors, leaving an abusive relationship can actually be the most dangerous time. As I was saying, the decision to leave an abusive relationship is not as straightforward as it might seem. Many factors must be weighed carefully, and when you look closely at these factors, the benefits and drawbacks to leaving are actually similar. There are two important things to remember as we're dealing with the issue of leaving or staying. The first thing to remember is that the only person who can truly stop the abuse is the abusive partner. The second thing is that people can and do find safety for themselves and their children after leaving an abusive relationship all the time, but they need to do it when the time is right for them. So let's look at some of these factors that we were talking about and the factors that survivors consider when they're deciding whether or not to leave or stay in an abusive relationship. So the possible risk if a survivor stays in an abusive relationship could be physical. If they stay, we know that they could have physical injury from their abusive partner. They could even experience death or death of a child. There's also risk to their health, so risk of sexually transmitted infections from their abusive partner. However, we also have to recognize the reality that if a survivor stays, they could also risk physical injury if the abusive partner continues to stalk, assault, or even escalates the violence after they leave. There's still that threat of death or death of a child if an abuser attacks them after leaving. And we have to know that leaving does not ensure that the abusive partner will not find them and will not harm them. And then if they leave, there's still that risk of sexually transmitted infections or other medical complications because unsafe sexual behavior might continue and they might be sexually assaulted by their abusive partner even after they've left. So when we weigh the factors and we look at if a survivor decides to stay or leave, we can see that either way they choose, there's also the risk of physical injury, death or death of a child, and then threats to their health. So let's look at children. The same risks exist with children. If a survivor stays, they risk physical injury to the children who witness or targets themselves of violence within the relationship or within the household. They also risk loss of children if the abusive partner makes false allegations of child neglect or abuse or failure to protect arguments with children's division, and that could be used to remove children or terminate parental rights. However, if the survivor decides to leave, they still risk physical or injury or harm to children who witness violence or who are hurt, maybe even at higher risk during unsupervised exchanges and visits. They also risk loss of children if their abusive children gains legal custody or simply takes the children or makes false allegations of child neglect or abuse. So the same risk of injury to the children and loss of children exist if they stay, if a survivor decides to stay or leave. Now let's look at financial factors. So if a survivor stays, they might be risking a lower standard of living if the abusive partner controls all the money, quits or loses employment, or makes the victim lose their own employment. However, we have to also recognize that they could risk losing income through an abusive partner's sabotage, or lose housing if the violence causes an eviction of the entire family, or they could risk losing or damaging their possessions if they are damaged or stolen by their abusive partner. Those same financial risks, though, also exist if a survivor leaves. There could be a lower standard of living if they have to rely on their partner's income, or only have one income after they leave, or if they have to change jobs or quit their job when they leave the relationship. They also risk losing income or job if they have to become a stay-at-home parent, or if the abusive partner sabotages their employment after they leave. They also risk loss of housing if they have to move out of their house when they leave the relationship. Sometimes they might even have to leave town, divorce their abusive partner, or go into hiding, and that means they lose their stable housing. Survivors could also experience loss or damage to their possessions if they have to leave their things behind, and their partner deliberately damages those. So again, same risk to their financial stability if they stay or leave. Family and friends. If a survivor stays, they could risk physical threats or injury to their families or friends, particularly if these friends are offering to help out. They could also risk losing support if the victim is isolated from their friends or family, or if they just stop supporting the victim as punishment for staying in the relationship. However, if a survivor leaves, they also have that risk to physical injury of friends, particularly if they're offering assistance. And then also they could risk losing support of family and friends who want that victim to stay in the relationship or marriage. So again, a victim will risk physical injury or threats to family or friends, loss of support, and loss of those relationships if they stay or leave. And finally, let's look at some possible psychological risk if they stay. There could be psychological harm, including verbal, emotional, and physical assaults that will continue if they stay in the relationship. There could also be use of substances such as alcohol and drugs to cope with the emotional and physical pain, including a potential for substance use. And then suicide might be threatened or attempted by their abusive partner. However, if a survivor leaves, they could also risk physical harm if the abusive partner continues to be in contact, especially if they have children in common. They could also risk using substances to cope with the past abuse in a new situation. And then suicide might also be a risk if it is threatened or attempted by the abusive partner in response to leaving. So again, whether or not a victim decides to stay or leave, they still risk physical harm, use of substances, and suicide. So in conclusion, a survivor faces very real dilemmas in deciding if they want to stay or leave in an abusive relationship. Our role is not to tell survivors to leave. Our role is to provide support and assistance to survivors no matter what they decide to do.